Hi guys, I'm Andrew Henderson from Nomad Capitalist, nomadcapitalist.com here in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And I wanted to make a video that explained a difference that some people have a little bit of difficulty really understanding. And that is the difference between a residence permit or a second residency and actual tax residency. Now I got the idea to talk about this not only because it's come up in discussions in the past, but because I saw an article today where the European Union is looking for public input to a whole white paper they put out about the idea that some Europeans might be using investment residence programs or citizenship by investment programs where you go and make a donation, buy property, whatever, to become a legal resident or citizen of another country. And that people were using this in the EU to escape their information sharing requirements under the Common Reporting Standards, CRS. Now, in this video, I'm going to speak to both US citizens as well as to European citizens. But what it is important to realize is that when we talk about getting a second residence permit, that speaks to the ability to live in a country. Yeah, it sometimes confers certain rights in that country. Some countries require you to have some kind of residence permit to open a bank account, to rent property, to buy property. But really, the point of a second residence permit just on its own is to have a place to go. Maybe you want to live there. Maybe it's a plan B for you. And it can also be part, but only part, of a tax non-resident strategy. So what some folks in the EU, and I imagine all over the world, are doing is they're going out and they're getting a passport from St. Lucia, for example. They make a donation, they get a passport. Now when they go to open a bank account in, let's say, Singapore, they say, hey, I'm St. Lucian, here's my passport, and perhaps they can get a tax ID number from that country, and then the bank in Singapore will report the information back to St. Lucia as part of CRS, rather than back to wherever it is that they're from, and therefore they can bypass the requirements for information sharing. And so what the EU is looking to do is kind of step in and put out that fire. So what people sometimes will do is they'll say, well, hey, I want to get a residence permit, that's going to solve all my tax problems. Or, hey, I'm going to get a second passport, that's going to solve all of my tax problems. No, it won't. For US citizens, there is FATCA. So FATCA was the first one. That's where governments share their information with the United States, and the United States gives them nothing in return. FATCA is information sharing from all around the world for US citizens. And so if you're a US citizen, it doesn't really matter if you are also St. Lucian or also St. Lucian and 29 other citizenships. As long as one of your citizenships is the United States, you are going to be eligible for FATCA. And so, obviously, there are people who have second passports. You're certainly welcome to use those to open bank accounts. If you were born in the United States, it's probably going to say born in the United States in most cases. The bank is certainly going to ask you if you are a U.S. citizen. And I can attest that if you're not a U.S. citizen, they're going to say, hey, please show us proof that you're no longer a U.S. citizen. So for U.S. citizens, there's not as much of an issue for the government because the U.S. government has made it pretty much mandatory that other countries indicate where you were born. One of my passports has the state where I was born written in there. I guess somebody who didn't know might not ask, but certainly when the bank asks you, hey, are you a U.S. citizen, you want to be honest about that. Now, on the European side, if you're a French citizen, for example, but you are legally living in Dubai, then you can become tax non-resident of France, and therefore your obligations, for the most part, would end. What people are doing, according to this EU white papers, they're going out and they're continuing to live in France, but getting some residence permit somewhere else, and then using that residence permit to basically is the repository for having their tax information sent or their bank information sent. I think that's going to become, from a practical point of view, more and more difficult because as I've opened bank accounts and the banks ask, what is your tax ID number? A lot of residence permits I have, I don't get a tax ID number. Or certainly it's much more complicated to get it in some of the cases that I've dealt with. So I don't know really how practical that is for any bank that's on the ball, but it does bring up, again, the important distinction. For US, if you're a US citizen, you're always in the information sharing system. For most of the rest of the world, as long as you're living in that country, as long as you're tax resident in that country, they're going to share your information. They want all of your foreign corporations reported and taxed. And until you decide to get out of that system, whether it's renouncing U.S. citizenship for Americans, whether it's becoming tax non-resident for everybody else, you're going to be part of the system. And not saying I agree with that system, but obviously for me, as someone who has something to lose, I like the idea of playing by the rules, and finding the best set of rules that work in your favor if you don't like those rules. What does that mean for Canadians, Australians, Brits, etc.? It means that not only getting that residence permit, but it means going through the proper channels to check out of your country. That, as we've been talking about for over a year now, through videos like the Nomad Tax Trap and others here on our channel, that is becoming a more complicated process. The days of simply just packing your bags and going and coming and going and coming and going, those are largely gone, with Australia being one of the most difficult in my opinion, Canada being relatively difficult, some countries in Europe being relatively difficult. There is a way to become tax non-resident, and then you avoid all this. But the important distinction that I think a lot of people get confused is a second residence permit does not mean you're a tax resident. That can be good or bad. Just obtaining a second residence permit on its face, I have a residence permit in Montenegro. I do not meet the qualifications to be taxed in Montenegro because I don't spend that much time there. But I have the ability to go there without needing a visa, and I can spend as much time as I want. Because I spend less time than they say I can spend before being taxed, I don't pay tax in Montenegro. So on its face, that's good. I have a residence permit, I can enjoy the place, but I don't pay tax. On the other hand, if all my residence permits were like that, then if I were the citizen of a country that wanted to tax me, or that wanted to have my information shared with them, I wouldn't really have any alternative to say, well, no, actually I'm being taxed over there. There are ways to obtain both second residence permits and tax residency, and to legally pay no tax. And that's really where it becomes a bit dicier. Obviously, there are plenty of people out there who will sell you a residence permit, sell you a passport. There are plenty of people who will give you advice about how to leave the country. But really, for me, if you don't want your information shared, and if you want to pay much less or even zero tax, there's a process of figuring out which country is going to give you the least amount of tax, if any at all. Figuring out how to get out of the system in your home country, and then figuring out how to make everything work together so that you're ticking all the boxes in both places. The idea of just renting a mailbox in some other country is not going to make you tax resident, even if you have a permit. And so this is what the EU is wising up to. The US long ago figured this out because they just tax you based on your citizenship. There's nothing to talk about. But it's very important that all the pieces of that puzzle work together. Having a second residence permit does not mean you have to pay taxes there. And people think, oh, if I get a residence permit, now I'm going to be taxed. I don't want one. No, that's not true. But if you want to avoid tax somewhere else and you're not a U.S. citizen, you should have some kind of residence permit and an entire tax residence strategy in another country, and it has to be done properly. Now, if you want to find out more about how to do that, we've got a lot more advanced stuff and the opportunity for some help at nomadcapitalist.com. If you're just getting started with these topics that we call the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle, definitely subscribe to our channel and check out the hundreds of videos discussing our internationalization strategies.